Good morning. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see so many of you showing up here, considering a bunch of you probably had some late night fun at the animal welfare mixer last night. But I get and I'm grateful that you're here because this is an important topic. This session, Critical Levers, Where to Push for Farmed Animals Now, will be presented by Zoe. As you all know, factory farming is arguably the greatest moral atrocity of our time. The number of animals that are farmed globally on land and in water is incomprehensibly large, and the severity of their suffering from psychological and physical harms that happens on these farms is equally unfathomable. A 300 million global animal movement is working to reform a 1.4 trillion industry. That sounds impossible, but NGOs, many of you work at these, are creating and executing various effective strategies to protect these animals. Zoe Sigle's talk focuses on current and emerging leverage points for farmed animal welfare movement strategy, so that we can collectively maximize our impact for animals. After her talk, I'll have some questions for Zoe, and you have the opportunity to add yours as well using swap cards. We might not have time for all of them, but that is great because that forces you to go to her office hours in junior ballroom number 4. Okay, briefly talk about Zoe. The first time I met Zoe, and I don't think that she knows this, but was at some workshop, and I was sitting next to her and thought she was intimidatingly smart. I briefly wondered if I was in the right place. Luckily, she's equally kind and supportive. She's also quite productive. Zoe is the Director of Philanthropic Advising and Programs at Farmed Animal Funders, a group that most of you are probably familiar with. They are a donor-leading community made up of foundations and individuals donating at least $250K annually to end factory farming. Zoe also serves as the fund manager with the EA Animal Welfare Fund. And previously, she led an international team at Mercy for Animals. There, she partnered with global food companies to develop meaningful farmed animal welfare policies. She has mentored and trained organizations around the world in corporate outreach techniques and strategy. And her educational background is a Master of Food and Agricultural Law and Policy degree from Vermont Law School, and a BA in Biology and Environmental Studies. Please welcome Zoe.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is a true pleasure to be back here on the EA Global stage. I spend my days thinking about the most impactful ways that we can help farmed animals. So over the last decade, I've worked on everything from grassroots advocacy at local levels to policy advocacy and research at state and federal levels. And then I also worked on corporate campaigns, corporate outreach at global levels. Now I get to spend my time working with and supporting philanthropists and finding exciting opportunities to help animals in the most impactful ways that match their own criteria. So while my entire career has been in animal advocacy, one of my hobbies along the way was aerial dance. And this is a really grainy video of me doing some fun drops like nearly a decade ago. But when I was doing this, I was learning how to climb fabric and make dramatic movements with slight shifts in my body. And it was not about brute force, right? It was about finding specific points to push where a small push could have a really big impact. And that's really relevant to the farmed animal protection movement today, because when we're fighting something massive, when we're pushing up against something massive, whether it's gravity or a $1 trillion industry, it's not about fighting, it's not about brute force, right? It's about finding specific leverage points that we can make. We can use small pushes to make really big changes. Okay. So today, in discussing farmed animal advocacy, I am going to talk about why farmed animals very quickly, because I think we have a lot of farm animal welfare experts in this room already. But then I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of leverage points: self-created, opportunistic, and inertial. And I'm going to talk about some case studies in our movement today. And then lastly, I'm going to wrap up with your leverage points. So why farmed animals? For any newcomers here to farmed animal advocacy, the first reason is the scale and the degree of suffering. The scale is truly unimaginable, unfathomable, just as Steen was sharing earlier, but every year there are about 94 billion land animals, 124 billion farmed fish, and trillions of shrimp and wild-caught fish that are killed for food and for feed. And while I recite these huge numbers, it can be really hard to think about the individuals involved here. But these individuals likely suffer from a myriad of abuses, and particularly the ones that are farmed. These include everything from genetic manipulation, which means that the animals are bred so that their DNA, their own DNA, is optimized for production and not actually for their own well-being. It can include painful mutilations, often without anesthetic. It can include overcrowding, physical restrictions to their behavior, and then, of course, slaughter at the end of their lives, often without a pre-slaughter stun. So despite being what I consider to be one of the worst moral atrocities of our time, this space receives very little funding overall. About 0.1% of global philanthropic dollars go towards supporting farmed animal welfare in terms of reforming and replacing the factory farming industry. However, the good news is that there are tractable strategies in this space to alleviate and reduce suffering for harms to billions of animals. But I don't want to sugarcoat the successes that we're having, right? Because we are up against an industry whose bottom line involves harm to animals. The farmed animal protection movement spends about $300 million annually to impact the lives of farmed animals to help replace and reform factory farming. That's our little tiny David in the corner. And then the animal ag industry has a revenue of $1.4 trillion annually. Now, this includes production expenses, but it also includes a lot of marketing-related costs, a lot of lobbying costs, profits, and more. And so when we look at these numbers, it's not great, right? For every $1 in farmed animal advocacy, their industry has about $4,666. But I don't share this to discourage. I actually share this for 3 reasons. One, this shows that the interventions that we have in our movement, the achievements that we've had to date, are actually pretty big in the context of the resistance that we're facing here. 2, for new funders to this space, if you are getting involved, and I'm talking like new major funders that are contributing $1 million, $10 million to the space, you can actually make a pretty big dent if those funds are spent in an effective way. And then lastly, this underscores how important it is that we are taking advantage of leverage points, that we're using strategy, because we can't fight dollar per dollar in this issue, right? We're going to need to be using strategy here. But here's what gives me hope. We're not just facing a problem of unprecedented scale, we're also facing an opportunity for unprecedented impact. And when systems are this large and this interconnected, finding the right leverage points can really create ripple effects that improve billions of lives. I mean, think about it. If we get a corporate policy win, that's not just impacting one animal, that's impacting possibly millions. If we're able to prevent a factory farm from emerging in an emerging industry, we're not just preventing harms to animals today, but harms to animals for decades to come. So when we look at how to create change in this wildly interconnected, massive system, there are 3 types of leverage points that I'm going to focus on in today's presentation. The first one are self-created leverage points, where we are deliberately engineering pressure points that did not exist before. I'm then going to talk about opportunistic leverage points. These are ones, it's like finding a crack in the wall. It's finding an opportunity where we can use, if we're in the right place at the right time, we can strategically exploit that opportunity. And then third are inertial, not initial, inertial. This is redirecting the future before momentum builds in the wrong direction. So we're going to start with self-created leverage points here. Self-created leverage points are the ones where we are deliberately engineering pressure points that did not exist before. And I don't think there's a better example at this than what is happening and what has happened with cage-free campaigns. Before I continue, though, I'm going to give an important note here. That $1.4 trillion industry that I mentioned earlier, I guarantee you they're going to have someone watching this online afterwards So I'm going to say hi to United Egg Producers. Hey, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, I see you. Okay, so with that in mind, please recognize that there is sensitive information that I cannot and will not share on this stage today. I appreciate everyone's understanding on that because we don't want to overshare our strategy in a public setting. Okay, so let's get back to cage-free. Back in 2015, battery cages were just the norm, the way things had been done for decades in the United States. And confining hens to spaces so small that each hen had less than a sheet of paper to live their entire life on, this was just the cost of doing business. But our movement did not wait for an opportunity, right? We created one. We used sophisticated corporate campaigns, corporate engagement, and through this, we were able to engineer a moment of urgency that transformed how companies thought about what was possible and necessary for animals. So in the US, this led to hundreds of major companies, we're talking major retailers, major restaurant chains, that made commitments to go cage-free. And that was even followed by legislation in some states, including here in California. Now, as a result, the US laying hen flock is now 40% cage-free compared to just 5% 10 years ago. And that means that every year there are close to 100 million hens that are no longer stuck in battery cages during their lives. And with the momentum in the US and Europe, it was clear that there was need for these strategies to go global. And so a unified coalition of organizations around the world worked together to get global commitments from some of the world's largest companies. And these commitments now have the potential, if implemented, to impact hens in most countries on Earth. But now it's 2025. And for those that are following the cage-free movement, you know that 2025 is a crucial moment for this movement because it's an important deadline for companies. 1,000 companies are facing their cage-free commitment deadlines this year. And some are on track, but others not so much. But the movement created a leverage point, right? We created a deadline, we got industry buy-in, and now it's our opportunity to hold companies accountable to those commitments, to their own commitments to the public. And so we now have leverage to advance the conversation, the progress, and the public pressure when needed. So one way that organizations are acting on this leverage, to no surprise to anyone following corporate campaigns, is campaigns, right? Calling out lagging companies publicly. Now, to be clear here, in our ideal scenario, campaigns aren't necessary. And in fact, if you look at companies that had commitments with deadlines prior to 2024, close to 90% of them actually fulfilled their commitments. So there's a lot of precedent for not needing campaigns to hold companies accountable. But when we need to, we now have an extra talking point where campaigns can speak to widespread values of trustworthiness and integrity. Another way that organizations are using this leverage point is through shareholder advocacy. Public companies, so the ones that are traded on the stock market, are required to present shareholder resolutions at shareholder meetings. And what this means is when a shareholder, someone that has shares in a company, they can go ahead and propose a resolution, and if it meets legal criteria, that company needs to present it to their shareholders at their annual meetings. Now, sometimes those resolutions are kind of embarrassing. They're asking why companies aren't fulfilling their commitments, like what progress they're making on them, why they aren't being transparent. And when it's really embarrassing, companies might try to negotiate with that shareholder that submitted the proposal to try and get them to withdraw that proposal. And sometimes that's successful and it accomplishes good things for animals. But if they don't, if the negotiations don't work out, then the shareholder resolution goes to a vote. So all of a company's top investors have to read this resolution and vote on it. And this can be a good opportunity to advance things like getting plans in place for suppliers to meet commitments. But not all organizations are carrying sticks here. Some are actually carrying carrots. And a few examples of this include organizations that are connecting companies with suppliers, and in some cases, actually certifying those suppliers. So this is going to be more the case in countries around the world where there aren't already certification agencies to be able to certify that cage-free, but to certify cage-free standards. But this is a way that some organizations are chipping in and helping. Additionally, recommending substitutions. So what this means is, if you are aware of at least the US, the avian flu is just like taking out the egg industry right now, which is really sad for all the laying hens that are unfortunately dying because of avian flu. But with all this going on, this is an opportunity for organizations to recommend substitutions, particularly plant-based substitutions that replace the functionality of egg-based ingredients. And this is happening. Some companies are really actually moving forward with this, which is pretty exciting to see. Lastly, organizations are helping out by facilitating cage-free credit systems. And again, this is just in some parts of the world where it might be particularly geographically difficult to get cage-free eggs in one part of a country to another part of a country, and this helps boost the cage-free egg supply chain. So this presentation is about where to act now, right? Now is the key word here. And I would argue this is one of the most important places we can be investing our resources, our funding, our time, our skills, our talent, because corporate commitments are only as effective as they are when they're implemented, right? A promise does not mean anything if it's not actually followed through on. There are literally over 100 organizations around the world working on cage-free campaigns in this space, cage-free accountability. If you are interested in this space and don't know where to get started, feel free to find me during office hours so I can point you in the right direction for organizations in your country. Okay. So while our cage-free work has been a great example of self-created leverage points, I'm now going to talk about opportunistic leverage points, where we are, again, finding that crack in the wall to see where is an opportunity that we can strategically exploit. And so this story is going to start in Europe, and particularly in the country of Denmark, which is a small country, but it punches well above its weight in agricultural influence. So in 2021, Denmark did something remarkable. They passed at the government level a national action plan for plant-based foods to help stimulate both the supply and consumer side of the plant-based transition in Denmark. And this was not just like a plan, they actually backed it up with funding. In fact, to date, over 174 million euros in funding have been committed to this by the Danish government. But it gets cooler when we bring this up to the EU level. So at the EU level in 2024, the EU Commission asked for a strategic dialogue on the future of EU agriculture. And our movement, we weren't just in the room. We were in the right room with the right relationships, the right people. And as a result, this strategic dialogue made a few really important recommendations that can help animals. One, that the European Commission should create an EU plant-based action plan by 2026. And secondly, that the EU Commission should revise their animal welfare legislation by 2026. Now, these are just recommendations. However, how do we turn that into policy? So, one of the governing bodies in the EU is the EU Council, and they are made up of heads of states for EU member states, and they rotate their president every 6 months. So this means that each country in the EU gets to be the president of the EU Council for once every about 13 and a half years. And this EU Council, they set the political agenda for the EU. Now, Denmark, that same Denmark that is leading in plant-based advocacy, holds their presidency for the EU Council this year, from July to December of this year. In addition to that, just in November, they passed a green tripartite agreement, which includes many things, including committing to advocate for an EU plant-based action plan. So, with all this political alignment, how do we turn that into real change? This is where farm animal funders came in last year with what I'm going to call leverage multiplication. We're not just trying to fund individual organizations, or projects, but we actually put together an advisory committee, an expert advisory committee, who is working to orchestrate a symphony of aligned efforts across Europe for this cause area. We're bringing together animal donors, we're bringing together climate donors, and we're working to fund diverse NGOs, not just in the animal sector, but especially in the environmental sector, the consumer protection sector. And these NGOs are engaging stakeholders across Europe that are even more diverse, right? Working to see how they can engage farmers' associations, health professionals, economists. And so if you think about this, when Danish leadership is working on presenting plant-based proposals, they're going to be met by a chorus of civil society actors across society that are wanting to be involved in this plant-based space and wanting to support this plant-based space. So this is what I consider to be a masterclass in opportunistic leverage points here, because we're taking a proven national model in Denmark. We're taking clear recommendations from the strategic dialogue. We're taking a sympathetic council presidency this year, and we're coordinating voices. We're helping to coordinate voices across civil society. And so when I talk about finding the right moment to push, I think this is it. This is what it looks like when we bring our resources together and focus in on one specific effort. Okay, we've talked about leverage points that change the system, but now I'm going to talk about leverage points that do not change the system. And I'm going to start this with a question. Who here in your advocacy has ever felt like bureaucracy, just like frustrated by bureaucracy? Okay, I'm not the only one. Yeah, it's a pretty common theme. Okay, so what if I told you that sometimes we can actually use that bureaucracy to our advantage? That bureaucratic molasses, we can actually use that to align with what is good for animals. So we're going to talk about insect farming here, because honestly, would this really be an EA, animal welfare talk, if I did not mention insects, right? Okay, so right now, the insect industry seems large, and it is, right? It's farming trillions of insects a year, but it is vastly smaller than its potential. While some people think about insects and human consumption, the insect industry is trying to get involved in feed for other animals, like chickens, like pigs, fish, shrimp, etc. And if just 25% of global fish meal were to be replaced by insects, we're expecting the amount of insects farmed to go up by the tens of trillions, and even more if we were to also farm insects for pigs, for chickens as well. But the good news here is that the future is not inevitable. We can still prevent huge amounts of future harms. So how do we do that? One way is through taking advantage of the status quo. And one part of the status quo is public engagement in this issue, right? Public interest in this issue. And there just is a lot of disgust. Now, of course, there are different views on consuming insects around the world and various cultures, but in at least parts of Western society, there have been surveys showing that close to half of people are disgusted by eating insects, and another 40% are really unsure about it. So this is an area in farm animal advocacy where we actually have the public pretty heavily on our side for this one. Secondly, are regulations and legislation. Those really slow-moving regulatory bodies that sometimes for folks interested in alt protein, we're like, why isn't this speeding up? Can we get things moving? This is an area where we can actually really use that bureaucratic molasses to our advantage. So as an example, in the EU has what are called novel food regulations, and these require that new food ingredients entering the food system must be approved by the European Food Safety Authority. Now, to be clear, they have already approved some insects for human consumption. So it's not like this is like a straight barrier, but this is something that can really slow down the introduction of more and more insects into Europe for human food consumption. Another example is in the UK. In the UK, insects are not allowed to be fed to pigs and poultry, and this is a result of a decades-old regulation related to mad cow disease from decades ago. And this bans processed animal proteins from being fed to pigs and to chickens as well. Now, DEFRA, which is the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK, they are actually right now doing consultations to introduce insects into feed for pigs and chickens. But this is, again, an opportunity for the movement, and the movement already is working on this. Organizations in the movement are working on this to push back on those consultations and do what we can to keep good regulations in place. And then lastly, in the US, this leans a little bit more into that disgust factor that I talked about earlier. But there are some places that are introducing insect farming bans, particularly at least one state, and right now that is in committee. Now, all of these regulations, right, there's to some degree work to overturn them. But again, this is a point where we can actually work on the defense instead of the offense this time. We can work to help preserve that status quo, and there are organizations that are doing that. Lastly, investments for the insect sector. So investments in insect farming have actually declined pretty significantly over the last few years. They went from about $500 million, so $500 million US dollars, to about $200 million US dollars. And companies are really struggling to raise capital. So we can think about, how can we ensure that remains the case? How can we keep driving those investments down? Now, new NGOs are working to uphold these barriers: investment barriers, regulatory barriers, public awareness barriers. And slowing down this industry as much as we can means that a lot fewer insects are suffering in the meantime. And it also allows more time for good alternatives to be developed, whether those are alternatives for human consumption, like alternative proteins, or alternatives for animal feed. Okay, we have talked about 3 powerful types of leverage points here. We've talked about self-created, opportunistic, and inertial, but now I'm going to talk about your leverage points, because everyone here has unique skills that they are bringing to this space. So first, I like to think about personal impact. What are the skills, the experiences you bring or can bring, and maybe aren't bringing yet, to help farmed animals? We're all really unique here, so I love to lean into that. Secondly, are network effects. Who do you know? Do you know important decision makers at important companies that can make changes for animals? Do you know politicians that have the ability to advance regulations or legislation that help animals? Do you know high net wealth individuals who might be interested in deploying philanthropy in this space towards effective interventions? And then lastly, for any funders in this room, strategic giving is so important. Going back to that 300 million to 1.4 trillion figure earlier, funding in this space is crucial, but more importantly is like making sure it goes to really effective interventions. Okay, if you are in that situation and there are just like too many funding decisions, I have a few suggestions. One, and I will also I'm going to share with you conflicts of interest or disclosures here. So one, EA funds, the Animal Welfare Fund, is something I would highly recommend. Full disclosure, I am a fund manager on the EA Animal Welfare Fund, but this is an opportunity to donate to a place where there is an expert group of fund managers working together to deploy funding in a way that allows us to really consider room for more funding of organizations and consider a vast range of applications. Animal Charity Evaluators also has a recommended charity fund. And also, full disclosure, the MC for our session, Steen, as you probably know, is the executive director of Animal Charity Evaluators. That's a great place to go to if you're interested in just donating to one fund and having it being distributed, or to learn about really great organizations in our space that are doing fantastic work. And then third, this is just for some folks, but if you are contributing at least $250,000 annually to reform or replace factory farming, you qualify for pro bono bespoke philanthropic advising from farmed animal funders. So if that is you, feel free to reach out to me on Swap Card, or you can also Google farmed animal funders and sign up for philanthropic advising online as well. So as we wrap up, I want to return to that image that I shared of David facing Goliath. But here's the thing, we are not just one David. We are a movement of Davids, each finding precise points where we can push to create massive change. Every corporate commitment, every policy win, every prevented factory farm, these were not achieved by matching the industry's resources dollar per dollar, right? They were achieved because we had really sharp strategy. And the leverage points that I talked about in this presentation, I did not discover them. They were discovered, they were developed, they were created and exploited by brilliant minds, including many in this room today, who I was so excited to see walk into the room at the beginning of the talk. So I'm going to leave you with the question of, what is your leverage point? Where can you push to create change that creates ripple effects further beyond your immediate reach? Because there's one thing that I know for certain, and it's that the next game-changing strategy for animals is not going to come from some distant mind. It very well could come from someone in this room, from people that work with you in this room, and people that are in the movement and thinking about the movement so seriously, like the people that are attending this conference. So we might be up against a Goliath here, but we have something a lot more powerful than size or money. When we coordinate, we have precision, we have strategy, and we have a movement. So I'm going to encourage us all to use our leverage points and use them together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first big leverage point you mentioned was cage-free. I'm going to start with a depressing little icebreaker to get to know you a little bit better.
Cool.
Would you rather be born as a female or a male chick of the egg-laying breed? Why?
Okay, good question. This is a really sad question. So for those that don't know, what is the different experience for females versus males born into the egg-laying hen industry? If you know biology, you know that males are not producing eggs. And so males are not needed by the egg industry at all. And as a result, usually within 24 hours of birth, they are identified as males and they are sent to death. And that could be anything from maceration, so being sent to a wood chip grinder essentially, to just being thrown in a trash bag and being crushed by his brothers, and suffocated. So that's like pretty awful. On the flip side, hens that are female, or chicks that are female, end up being needed by the egg industry. And so as a result, they are put into that industry. If they're in battery cages, they are subjected to life in a very small cage for virtually their entire life, usually with about 3 to 9 other hens in a cage, usually around like the size of a microwave. So it's pretty small. And they're stuck their entire lives in this space. And that causes a lot of physical harm. It causes a lot of psychological harm. They can't move their bodies. As they're laying eggs, they are laying about 250 to 300 eggs a year compared to 12 to 20, which is normal. And so for anyone that has menstrual cycles, you probably could imagine if you went from 12 menstrual cycles a year to like 250 or 300, it would be insane. So with that said, I think the net amount of suffering experienced by female chicks is truly awful. And for that reason, I would hope to be born a male chick, which is really sad. But there are also some technologies that are being developed around the world called in vivo sexing technology that I know you are familiar with. And for in vivo sexing, this means that they are identifying the sex of the chick, ideally before pain receptors are even developed. And so in my ideal world, like if I had to be a male chick or a female chick, I'd hope to be a male chick, and particularly one that was identified before I even had pain receptors. Yeah.
Thank you for humoring my depression.
Yeah.
Okay, practical questions. As someone who switched from the animal advocacy side to the funding side, which in a way is still advocacy, but you get what I mean. It's clear that you identified this as a particular tactic within our movement that is effective. What made you make that choice, and how do you think in general about funding versus talent in this space? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So let's see, where do I start? I always will consider myself an advocate. I am an advocate, and also like now in the philanthropy side of things. I think a few reasons that I was so excited about getting into philanthropy was, one, seeing how much need there was in this movement. There is just so much potential for us to scale this movement because we're working against such a large scale issue. And I do think that one of the important bottlenecks in the space right now is that funding, and particularly getting funding to really effective causes. So for me, when I was thinking about my impact in this space, there are a lot of talented individuals that are doing that direct advocacy. And I was really excited to be able to take the expertise that I had across a wide range of advocacy levers and my network in this space to be able to use that and bridge the gap between advocates and funders in this philanthropic advising role. So I would say that's important. Were there other parts of your question that I didn't get to?
Maybe, but I don't want to ignore the swap card question, so I'm going to take a peek there. How do funders, getting back to your earlier question or your topic about being in funders versus in the movement more directly, and leverage points, how as a funder do you consider leverage points in evaluating grant proposals?
Yeah. So there are so many different kinds of funders in this space, but there are a lot of them that consider theories of change that I think in this EA space we're all pretty familiar with. And for those that aren't, that basically means how do we create a logical path between activities and inputs to the immediate outputs, to the intermediate outcomes, the long-term outcomes, and then ultimately to impact. And so when we're going along that logic chain, right, it's important to think about what are the assumptions that are being made at each point. And then also, this is when we can also think about are we taking advantage of, are we creating leverage points through this process? Are we finding opportunities that we can really take advantage of? And I think, so I would say through theories of change is the way that a lot of funders are looking at this concept. Yeah.
You mentioned insect farming bans. Do you know if there are particular states that are considering those?
Yeah, so right now, Colorado's considering it. Colorado's the only one I know of right now.
Okay.
And it's in committee, so I want to be very clear, it's not passed. We'll see how things go.
Okay. As a fundraiser, do you think we should seek out philanthropic spaces where we are unique rather than always attending the same specialized ones?
So one thing I'm really excited about, at least with farm animal funders, is as a movement, we need to be expanding and diversifying our donor base. We just need to in order to scale. And so there are, I'm finding more and more hope going out there and talking to different foundations that have, for example, climate goals that are becoming more interested in food systems because they're really connecting the dots between how much our food systems impact climate and particularly interventions to reduce factory farming, how that can actually have really good greenhouse gas emission implications. And so I do think it's valuable for us to be in as many rooms as we can. With that said, we need to be strategic. We do not have infinite time. But yeah, I do think it's helpful to diversify as opposed to all attending just the same conferences with the same funders. With that said, also a lot of traditional animal funders are going to be at some of those bigger animal conferences, but we can and should be attending outside of our space as well, because farm animal advocacy overlaps with so many cause areas. I think we all know this. It overlaps with climate, with public health, with environmental racism. It's just a very interconnected cause area.
What talent gaps can students or young professionals fill to contribute to the effective animal advocacy movement?
Yeah, so I think right now we're seeing in this space a few different areas that come to mind for me are one, on the policy side, there are actually some really cool incubator programs that are happening both in the US and in Europe. One is run by a group, I think, called Food Policy Pathways, and another one is run in Europe by Animal Advocacy Careers, I believe. And these groups are helping people interested in policy get involved in policy, because we do need people in policy that know how to do it and in those, in places of power within our agencies. So that's exciting. I think also overall, top leadership management is really important in our space. There's opportunity for folks that are maybe coming in from outside of animal advocacy. If they have really great high-level management skills, those could be a great translation into our space. I think there's a need for that. And then lastly, for folks that are in more neglected areas of the world, in terms of there just not being a lot of animal advocacy as is, we need you in this space. We are looking for talent in all places around the world. And so There are a lot of incubation programs that folks can get involved with. Again, talk to me in office hours if you're looking for that. But we really want to encourage more talent, especially from places where there's opportunity for like such an incredible emerging animal movement. And there just needs to be that like training and exposure to what's worked in other places so people can adapt it to what makes sense in their local contexts.
I think I'm going to ask you two more insect questions. I can't resist. Okay, the first one, a clarifying one from Gina. Hi, Gina. Are half of Americans disgusted with eating insects themselves or also with eating other animals that were fed insects? Do you know that?
Yeah, so that survey was specifically for human consumption, I believe, and did not include insects as feed for animals. I don't have data off the top of my head on that level of disgust. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. And then how do you weigh the moral value of preventing insect farming against other priorities like chickens?
Yeah. So when we think about insects, there's a few different considerations here. One is like the likelihood of their sentience. And there have been a variety of estimates out there. I tend to lean in like the 30 to 60 percentile of likelihood of sentience for them. And with that in mind, when we think about the expected value, right, like we multiply that by the number of insects that are out there, we get like a general gist of, are we comfortable with, we're in the trillions at this point, trillions of insects suffering every year. And so because there's a potential for so much scale in this industry, I do think it's something that is so valuable for us to be investing right now in experimenting and finding those interventions that work to continue driving it down and prevent a future of insect farming. But I also don't think that this, because it's so experimental, should come at the cost of some more proven interventions in this space. I think that maybe as new folks, new funders are coming into this space and new people are being interested, I encourage insects, but I don't necessarily encourage others to divert from highly impactful chicken work or, work on things like cage-free campaigns, broiler chicken campaigns. If we're having impact there, like we know that, let's not just like stop doing that in order to go for something where there's a lot of uncertainty, but still high impact potential.
Cool.
Yeah.
A very different question. Do you have a sense or do you have a number in your head? Like what is the dollar amount threshold where you would recommend bespoke funding over a fund?
Bespoke funding over a fund.
So I'm guessing
yeah.
to a specific charity is what is meant. If that's not what you meant, Matt, speak up.
Yeah, so let's see, a specific dollar amount. I think I would say, I don't actually know if I would like put a number threshold on that. I would say if you are someone that feels really confident about and aligned with what funds are doing, I would say donate there. But if you are someone that's like, I really want a strong relationship with the grantee directly, which could be the case for some people. Some people really want that funder experience of being like directly connected to organizations. Some people want to learn more about the space and like actually be on the boards of organizations so they can learn and help and support in ways that go beyond funding. I think those are opportunities to donate directly to organizations. And to be clear, I would never discourage folks from donating directly to organizations if they're excited about what the organizations are doing. So yeah, what I shared in terms of those two funds are just opportunities of if you're like, this is overwhelming, there's too many decisions, those are great options. But if you want to go through those evaluations yourself and explore and get to know organizations, like please do that. And also if you're giving a lot and you need help with that, please contact me and I'm happy to help you with that as well.
Is there anything that you miss from your non-funding days, from your activisty days?
Oh, I love that question. Oh my God, there's so much I could say. I think it's really fun being on the front lines. When I was doing corporate engagement, it was just really exciting being able to like point directly to myself and my team and being like, yeah, we were the ones that directly convinced the largest food service providers on earth to make these commitments, to like actually make progress on them and to start off really important cage-free credit systems in parts of the world. So I think that was really exciting. When you're in a funding position, you're a step away from that. And so it's not like as direct of a win. And so I think it's like easier to see that fulfillment when you are doing that direct advocacy than when you're in a funding space, but also there's just like an enormous amount of impact that you can have in the philanthropic space as well. So I would say that's one area, and I could probably talk for a long time, but I'll leave it with just that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to do one final question, and I hope your answer is positive, because otherwise we're going to leave on a little bit of a downer. But ballpark it, what is the likelihood that we end factory farming in America within 50 years?
Ooh, within 50 years, I would say like 10 to 15%, maybe. Maybe a little bit higher. I think there's so much uncertainty right now, at least in the US, an unbelievable amount, that I think it's really hard to even make predictions for the next like 5 years. Yeah, so we'll see.
Okay.
But I do think there's a chance. I think there's a chance
She's
for
not ruling it out.
a large amount of opportunity for reduction. So like, will it be banned in the US in 50 years? I don't know. But I think there's a ton of opportunity for us to really drive down the practices. And frankly, we need to. Like, if we want to have a livable planet, we need to. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really lovely to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for actively listening, asking good questions, and especially for working on these issues. And yeah, can you give Zoe one more?
Aw, thank you. Thank you, Sting.